A few nights ago, I found myself standing on the edge of Sinicity Square in Kabukicho, watching a girl who couldn't have been older than 16. She was sitting on a flattened cardboard box, surrounded by a fortress of convenience store plastic bags, scrolling through her phone with an expression of pure, unadulterated boredom. To a casual observer, she looked like a symbol of ultimate rebellion, someone who had successfully escaped the suffocating pressure of Japanese society to live by her own rules in the neon heart of Shinjuku. There was an almost enviable air of freedom about the group she was with. They were loud, they were messy, and they seemed to own the pavement. I watched a passing businessman stop to give them some change, his face a mask of pitying kindness. For a moment, it felt like a strange sort of harmony, the rigid world of the salaryman acknowledging the chaotic, liberated world of the Toyoko kids. It looked like a social safety valve working in real time. But then the atmosphere shifted instantly. A heavy police van pulled up, its red lights pulsing against the damp asphalt. I expected a scene of defiance, a cinematic stand for their way of life. Instead, the girl didn't even look up at first. When the officers began systematically dismantling their makeshift camp, she didn't fight or scream about her rights. She just stood up, shouldered her backpack, and looked at the officers with a chillingly blank stare. The businessman, who had been so charitable moments before, didn't stay to help or protest. He actually stepped back, smoothed his suit, and watched the sweep with a faint, satisfied nod, as if you were watching a janitor finally arrive to clean a particularly stubborn stain. That sudden transition from a scene of supposed social rebellion to a clinical exercise in urban sanitation left me struck. It made me realize that what we call freedom in these urban pockets might just be the visible symptom of a state that has temporarily lost its will to enforce order. And as the square cleared, the real question wasn't where those kids would go, but what happens to a civilization when it decides that order is no longer a requirement, but an option.
Wow. That is a hell of an opening image. It really, it sets the stage for the tension we're going to be living in for this whole deep dive.
It does, doesn't it?
You have this romantic idea of liberty on one side, the girl, the rebellion, that sort of messy freedom. And then on the other side, the crushing clinical reality of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it's uncomfortable.
It was incredibly uncomfortable. It felt like watching a glitch in the Matrix, you know? One minute, everyone's pretending this is fine, that it's just youth culture.
Right, it's social safety valve, like you said.
Exactly. And then the next minute, the state machinery just turns on and wipes it all away like it was never there. It really stuck with me because it felt like two different versions of reality colliding.
That collision is precisely what we need to dissect today. Because what was witnessed there wasn't just, a police sweep. It was a stress test of a civilization. And we're going to perform a kind of forensic analysis of that exact moment.
Forensic analysis.
Yeah, using a stack of sources that, to be honest, feels a bit like a detective's case file. We have field notes on the Toyoko kids phenomenon, but we're crossing that with some pretty heavy academic work on state capacity, real estate market reports, criminology data, a whole mix.
And normally one would just say, the police cleaned up the square, but you're suggesting there's something much deeper happening here, something mechanical.
Mechanically and philosophically. I mean, the central theme that emerges from all these documents is this constant battle between order and entropy.
Entropy. Okay, that's a physics term, right? Things just naturally falling apart.
Exactly. It's the tendency of any system, whether it's a car engine or an entire city, to decline into disorder if you stop pouring energy into it. If you stop maintaining your house, it doesn't just stay the same, it rots. The thesis here, the argument being made, is that what looks like freedom in Kabukicho is actually entropy. It's a symptom of Spenglerian decadence.
Okay, you dropped the bomb early. Spenglerian decadence. I know that name, Oswald Spengler, the historian, but let's unpack that before we get into the weeds. Because decadence usually makes people think of, I don't know, people eating grapes on a chaise lounge, not homeless kids in Shinjuku.
It's a common misconception, a really common one. When Spengler wrote The Decline of the West, he wasn't really talking about moral sin or, partying too much. He viewed civilizations as organic entities.
They're living creatures.
Exactly. Living creatures. They have a youth, a prime, which he called culture. And then they start to harden into what he called civilization, and eventually they hit their winter.
A winter phase.
And decadence, in that Spenglerian sense, is that winter. It's the point when a civilization loses its immune system.
Its immune system.
It loses the collective will to hold itself together. Standards start to slip. Social cohesion breaks down. The people stop believing in the sort of the grand mission of their society, and they retreat into their own private worlds. It's an atomization.
So applying that to the scene in the square, the argument is that the disorder, the grime, the kids sleeping on cardboard, that's not a sign of a vibrant, tolerant culture.
No. The argument is that it's rot. It is a visible sign that this civilization is just too tired, too worn out to maintain its own standards. When you saw that businessman step back and nod,
Yeah, that was a chilling moment.
that was him acknowledging that the winter had been temporarily held back by the police. But the very fact that the girl was there in the first place, it suggests the immune system is already failing.
That is an incredibly bleak way to look at it. So we shouldn't look at that girl and see a rebel. We should look at her and see a symptom of a dying organism.
That is the provocation.
Yeah.
And to see if it holds up, we need to look at the mechanics of the city itself. We're going to break this whole deep dive down into 3 pillars. First, the physical decay, this idea of urban metabolism.
Okay.
Second, the money, the actual economic cost of this disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And third, the digital side how technology is in fact accelerating this rot.
Right. Let's start with the physical then. Because when I think of Tokyo, I don't usually think of rot. I think of, pristine trains, vending machines that always work, streets you could literally eat off of. But this first narrative suggests that image might be cracking.
Let's get into it.
I heard a story about an aging maintenance contractor in Shinjuku who has spent 30 years polishing the brass rails and checking the pavels of Kabukicho. He remembers a time when the urban metabolism of Tokyo functioned like a Swiss watch. Every crack repaired before it could widen, every shadow illuminated by a state that cared for its skin. Now, as he scrubs graffiti near the Toyoko building, he watches the Toyoko kids gather in the cracks of the infrastructure. To him, the grime isn't just dirt. It's a symptom of a slowing pulse. He feels that when a city stops maintaining its physical perfection, it loses its moral authority over the streets. I saw this and couldn't help but feel a sense of mourning. As a YouTuber covering global shifts, I see this not just as a failure of cleaning crews, but as the visible erosion of the East Asian miracle. When the state stops valuing the physical order of its streets, the soul of the city begins to drift into decadence. It's a harsh realization. Without the discipline of maintenance, the freedom of the city becomes a vacuum for chaos.
Urban metabolism. This is such a powerful biological metaphor, isn't it?
It makes you think of the city as a living body that needs constant cellular repair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A city is constantly dying and being reborn. Concrete cracks, paint peels, trash accumulates. To keep a city alive and orderly requires a massive, constant injection of energy.
And this maintenance contractor, he sounds like he's taking it personally, like the graffiti is a direct insult.
Because to him, and to this whole theory of state capacity, it is. The argument being put forward is that the physical state of the street, how quickly a paver is fixed, how fast the graffiti is removed, is the most visible, the most immediate metric of national will. It's the broken windows theory on steroids.
The broken windows theory, the idea that if you leave a broken window unfixed, it signals that no one cares and then more windows get broken and eventually crime moves in.
It signals a loss of control. It's an invitation for entropy to take over.
I want to push back on this a little bit, though. Is a little bit of trash really the end of the world? I mean, if you go to New York or Paris, there's trash everywhere. People just step over it. Is Tokyo really decaying just because of one square in Shinjuku?
That's the right question to ask.
Right.
Is this just a localized mess, or is it systemic? And to answer that, we have to look at how Tokyo is supposed to work. And for that, we have a pretty technical document in our stack.
Yeah.
It's from the American Public Transportation Association, APTA.
APTA.
Yeah, and it's a study comparing the rail infrastructure of Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore.
Okay, so we're going from a philosophical contractor to subway engineering. Why rail? What's the connection?
Because in a city like Tokyo, the rail system is the urban metabolism. It is the circulatory system. If the rail fails, the city dies. And the report highlights a very specific, very East Asian business model used in Tokyo and Hong Kong called vertical integration.
Vertical integration. In business school, that usually means you own your own supply chain, like Apple making its own chips so they don't have to rely on anyone else. What does that look like for a train?
Well, in most Western cities, and originally in many places, you have a government agency that owns the tracks, and maybe a different operator runs the trains, and the land around the station is owned by all sorts of private developers. It's fragmented.
Right, different companies, different agendas.
In Tokyo specifically with a company like JR East, and in Hong Kong with the NPR Corporation, they use what's described as super vertical integration. The rail operator doesn't just run the trains. They own the land. They own the shopping malls above the station. They own the office towers and hotels connected to the station.
Right, I've seen that. You get off the train in Shinjuku and you are literally inside a department store. I think it's Luminate, and that's owned by the train company.
Exactly. It's a strategy called land value capture. Because the operator owns the mall, the hotel, and the office tower, they have a massive direct financial incentive to keep the entire environment pristine.
Explain that connection a bit more.
Think about it from their perspective. If the station is dirty or dangerous, or if the trains are consistently late, people don't want to come and shop at your mall. Businesses don't want to rent your expensive office space. The value of your real estate plummets. So JR East isn't keeping the station floors gleaming just because they're nice people. They're keeping them clean because grime is literally bad for business.
So it's a self-sustaining loop of order. The profit from the mall pays for the shiny floors and the security guards in the station.
Correct. It creates a fortress of order because the incentives are perfectly aligned. The state capacity is, in this case, reinforced by the market itself. But, and this is the key contrast, the report compares this to Singapore, specifically a period where they got this very wrong.
Singapore? That's surprising. I thought Singapore was the gold standard for this stuff. The city of rules.
Usually, yes. But the report discusses a specific era where Singapore experimented with what's called vertical separation. They followed a very neoliberal, very Western idea. Let's split the infrastructure ownership from the operations to create market competition and efficiency.
So the government owns the tracks, and a private company just rents them to run the trains.
Exactly. It sounds smart on paper. It sounds like theoretical efficiency. But in practice, specifically with their operator SMRT, it created a disaster. Because the operator didn't own the infrastructure, they had no long-term incentive to invest deeply in maintenance.
Ah, it's the homeowner versus renter problem. If I'm renting a house for a year, I'm not going to spend $10,000 to fix the roof. I'm just going to put a bucket under the leak and call the landlord.
You've hit the nail on the head. And in Singapore's case, the bucket wasn't enough. The source notes this led directly to underinvestment in maintenance and a breakdown in information flow. It all culminated in massive system-wide disruptions. We're talking about cable ties snapping, literally, cheap plastic ties holding critical cables together, causing the entire system to shut down for hours.
Cable ties, that is the perfect image of entropy creeping in, the slow degradation.
That is the entropy. The system degraded because the immune system, the incentive to maintain, was broken by that structural separation.
But Singapore fixed it, right? I mean, their trains work now.
They did, and this is the crucial point the analysis makes. The Singaporean government, the state, saw the failure. They didn't argue about it for a decade. They stepped in, renationalized aspects of it, completely restructured SMRT, and poured billions into fixing it. They had the state capacity to admit the error and override the market failure.
They acted decisively.
They acted. Now, bring this all back to Kabukicho. Tokyo has this perfect commercial structure for the trains. The stations are immaculate. They are safe. But the street, the public square where that girl was sitting, that doesn't generate profit for a railway company. That falls on the public sector.
And that's where the gap is, the breakdown.
That is the gap. The maintenance contractor from the story, he sees the Toyoko kids as a rust spot that the commercial interests can't or won't scrub away because it's a social problem, not a business problem. It requires the state to act. And the argument here is that, unlike Singapore, which aggressively fixed this technical rail problem, the Japanese state has been hesitating on this social problem.
So what we're seeing is a perfectly clean station, a fortress of order, and then right outside the doors, the rot is setting in. It's like the immune system is working perfectly on the vital organs, the trains, but the skin is getting infected.
That's a vivid way to put it, a very accurate one. And that infection has a cost, a real quantifiable cost. We tend to think of this as just kids hanging out or a social issue. But the second part of our deep dive shows that this disorder is starting to show up on the balance sheet.
Right, because at the end of the day, someone has to pay the rent. And in Kabukicho, the rent is getting complicated. This brings us to the economic cost of disorder. And there's a story here from a business owner that really grounds this in reality.
Let's hear it.
I recently read a digital thread from a small business owner who inherited a legacy izakaya near the heart of the disorder. He shared his ledger books, not just numbers, but a map of a retreating civilization. For every new disorder zone established by the aimless youth, his property value and his sense of safety drop. He described the economic drag as a heavy, invisible fog. Tourists turn away, and the vibrant commerce that once funded the neighborhood's safety is cannibalized by the cost of extra security. He argued that strict law enforcement isn't about cruelty, it's the most basic form of economic protection for the working class. Thinking about his struggle, I realize how easy it is for us to prioritize sentimentality toward the delinquent while ignoring the quiet destruction of the productive. We often forget that high-trust societies are expensive to build but terrifyingly cheap to destroy. While I sympathize with the broken homes these kids come from, we must ask, at what point did our empathy for the individual become a death sentence for the community's prosperity?
Economic drag. That is the key term here.
It sounds like physics again, like friction slowing everything down.
It is friction. And the analysis introduces a concept called security realism. It's a blunt idea. It argues that strict law enforcement isn't just about morality or being a strict father to society. It is an economic necessity. It's the absolute foundation that allows the productive class, like that izakaya owner, to operate.
It makes intuitive sense. If your customers are scared to walk down the street to get to your restaurant, you don't sell any yakitori. It doesn't matter how good your food is.
And we have hard data to back this up. I was looking at a Japan retail report from Savills, the global real estate firm, and it paints a very specific, almost surgical picture of what's happening in Tokyo's property market.
Is it really that bad? I mean, land in Tokyo is gold. It's legendary.
It is, but even gold can tarnish. The report shows a bumpy recovery for retail across the city, but the real story is in the disparity. It explicitly highlights that vacancy rates remain stubbornly high in prime areas like Kabukicho. It mentions that large sites remain empty.
Large sites. We're not talking about a corner shop. We're talking about department store-sized spaces.
Yes. The report specifically mentions the departure of major tenants like Barney's New York and huge electronics retailers. These are anchor tenants. When they leave a black hole in the fabric of the neighborhood. The report notes that high rents combined with the pandemic and, crucially, this prevailing atmosphere of disorder have led to what they call rent corrections.
Rent correction is the most polite corporate speak I've ever heard for nobody wants to pay that much to be next to a trash fortress.
And to drive the point home, the report contrasts this immediately with Ginza.
Ginza, the luxury district, Chanel, Louis Vuitton, the works.
Right. Ginza is known for extreme order. The streets are spotless, the private security is visible, the management is strict. And what does the report note? Ginza has low vacancy, and the luxury goods industry is performing exceptionally well. So you have a tale of two cities within Tokyo. The zone of high order is thriving. The zone of growing disorder, Kabukicho, is suffering a direct economic penalty.
It's the iron law of capital. Money is a coward. It runs away from chaos and it runs towards safety and predictability.
And that businessman in our opening story, the one who walked away from the kids and nodded at the police. He represents that capital retreating. But it's not just about empty storefronts. The disorder also changes the nature of crime itself. This is where the story gets, well, even darker.
This brings us to that AP News piece about the shift from the Yakuza to this new thing, the Tokuyu.
Yes, this is a fascinating and disturbing evolution. When we think of Japanese crime, we think of the Yakuza. The tattoos, the missing fingers, the sharp suits.
The so-called honorable bad guys?
In a strange way, yes. They were the old order of crime. They were hierarchical. They had physical offices with business cards. They were, in their own way, regulated. And believe it or not, they provided a form of order. They didn't want random street crime because it brought police heat and disrupted their own businesses.
Right. They kept the streets safe for their own racket.
Exactly. But the source notes that Yakuza membership has collapsed. It's down to about 20,000 members due to very strict, very effective anti-gang laws.
Which sounds like a huge victory for the police. A win for order.
You would think so. But nature abhors a vacuum. And the decline of the highly structured Yakuza has given rise to the Tokuyu.
Tokuyu, what does that translate to?
It refers to anonymous, fluid crime groups. They don't have a boss and a fancy office. They don't have a code of honor. They are recruited via social media. The term used is dark part-time jobs.
Dark part-time jobs? That sounds like the gig economy from hell.
It is the Uberification of crime. A young, broke person sees an ad on Twitter or Telegram. High-paying delivery job, quick cash. They sign up. They're told to go to a specific address, smash a window, grab the watches, and leave them in a locker. They don't know who hired them. They don't know who gets the goods. It's completely atomized.
So it's not organized crime. It's disorganized crime.
It is highly entropic.
Yeah.
It's chaotic. And because it's so fluid, it's much, much harder to police. You can't just arrest the boss because there is no single boss. And this contributes directly to the sense of chaos in the Toyoko zone. Those kids on the cardboard boxes, they are the perfect recruitment pool.
They're sitting there broke, bored, scrolling on their phones, and suddenly a DM pops up offering fast cash.
Exactly, it's predatory. And the economic cost, the quantifiable damage. The AP source mentions that credit card fraud damage, just one slice of this, reached a record high of 54 billion yen in 2023.
54 billion, that's over 350 million US dollars.
That is a direct tax on the Japanese economy, driven by this new, chaotic, digitally enabled form of criminality.
So when the police sweep the square, they aren't just being mean to kids. They're trying to break the recruitment pipeline for this 54 billion yen problem.
Which brings us to the criminology source in the stack, this academic paper on crime tensors. Now, it's based on Chicago data, but the principles are universal. It distinguishes between crime generators and crime attractors.
Okay, let's decode that.
A crime generator is a place with lots of people where crime just happens to occur, like pickpocketing at a busy train station. A crime attractor, on the other hand, is a place that specifically draws in motivated offenders. The argument is that the Toyoko zone has transformed from a generator to an attractor. It pulls in the Tokuri recruiters.
It's become a magnet for predators.
A magnet, yes. The analysis argues that hotspot policing, which is basically targeted, intense deterrence, is effective. But it has to be maintained. The moment you pull back, the crime returns. It argues that the state must be willing to use force to excise the unreclaimable factors.
Excise. That sounds surgical, clinical.
The text uses the term social anti-epidemic. You don't negotiate with a virus. You sanitize the area to stop the spread.
That is a very, very clinical way to look at human beings.
And that's the fundamental tension. To the izakaya owner, that sanitation is his economic survival. To the 16-year-old girl, it's the end of her world for that night. But the argument from the material is that prioritizing the girl's perceived freedom over the community's prosperity is a suicidal trade-off for a society to make.
It's a heavy trade-off. But there's one more layer to this decay, a really crucial one. We've talked about the physical street and the money, but we have to talk about the digital world, because that girl in the intro, she wasn't looking at the police, she was staring at her phone.
And that phone is the gateway to our third and final pillar, the erosion of trust in the digital age.
Let's get to the third narrative. Try to imagine a young girl sitting on a cold curb, her face illuminated by the blue light of a smartphone, navigating a decentralized world of papakatsu and underground digital circles. I came across a study discussing how these digital platforms act as accelerators for social atomization. In the old days of Tokyo, the state capacity was felt through social pressure and community eyes. Now, the digital void has created a systemic vulnerability where high-trust societies are being hacked from within. The girl isn't a rebel. She is a ghost in a machine that the state has failed to regulate. Reading about this digital lid decay, I feel a chilling sense of Spenglerian decline. We are watching the transition from a disciplined, cohesive civilization to a collection of atomized individuals lost in a digital forest. As someone who lives in the digital space, I find it ironic and tragic. We've built tools that offer total freedom, but without a robust framework of order to guide the youth, that freedom is merely an invitation to banish into the dark. It's a reminder that a civilization that cannot protect its digital and physical borders is one that has already begun to say goodbye.
And this brings us right back to Spengler. The winter of civilization is marked, above all, by atomization.
Atomization. Like we're all just floating atoms not connected to a larger molecule anymore.
That's a perfect way to put it. The bonds dissolve. The Toyoko kids aren't a community in the traditional sense of the word. They are a collection of isolated individuals who just happen to be in the same physical space. But their real connection, their real community, is in the digital void.
The narrative mentioned papakatsu. That's essentially sugar daddy dating, right?
But in this context, it's often a gateway to exploitation and crime. And the analysis highlights a specific case that proves this systemic vulnerability. It mentions a group of scammers arrested for using Monero.
Monero, right. That's the cryptocurrency that's famous for being private, right?
Yep.
The one you can't trace.
The most anonymous one, yes. The AP source details how 18 scammers were arrested. They were recruited via social media, again, those dark part-time jobs. And they used high-anonymity apps in Monero to launder the money they stole.
So let's trace that chain. You have a 16-year-old on a curb, recruited by an anonymous app, paid in untraceable crypto to commit fraud against a grandmother she's never met and will never meet.
That is the systemic vulnerability in a nutshell. Think about how a high-trust society like Japan is supposed to work. People leave their bikes unlocked. They leave their wallets on cafe tables. Why? Because of social shame. Because your neighbors know you. Your family knows you. There are consequences.
But the app destroys all of that. The app doesn't know shame. It has no neighbors.
The digital space bypasses all traditional social controls. It allows crime to completely bypass the immune system of the community. It is, in effect, hacking the society from within. The state is trying to police a ghost.
So if Tokyo is struggling with this liberal decay, this inability to police the ghosts, is there an alternative? The sources mention Singapore and China. How do they handle this? Because one doesn't hear about Toyoko kids in Singapore.
And one doesn't. This brings us to a very significant paper in our stack. Institutional Diversity and State-Led Development. Singapore as a unique variety of capitalism.
A unique variety of capitalism? That sounds like a very polite academic way of saying state control.
But it's a specific and highly effective economic model. The paper argues that Singapore and China operate under a system where the state retains absolute control over what are called strategic nodes. Specifically, the factor markets.
Factor markets. Okay, take me back to Econ 101. What does that mean in plain English?
It means land, labor, and capital. The three basic building blocks of any economy. In a liberal system like the US, or to a large extent Japan, these are mostly in private hands. In Singapore, the state holds the keys to all three.
Okay, let's break that down. Land.
This is the big one. In Singapore, the state owns about 90% of the land.
90%?
Yes. Through their concept plan. This means they don't just regulate zoning, they own the dirt. This allows them to engineer the physical environment completely. There are no forgotten corners or disorder zones like Kabukicho because every square inch is accounted for, managed, and optimized by the state.
So they don't have these zones because the landlord, the government, doesn't allow for them. There are no cracks for the weeds to grow in.
Correct. They can simply redevelop or repurpose the land if it starts to decay. Now let's look at labor.
Okay.
Manpower planning. The source details how they use state scholarships to direct the best and brightest talent into specific fields the economy needs. But it also mentions strict social discipline. You know, the famous laws against vandalism, chewing gum. It's not just about punishing crime. It's about shaping the entire workforce to be orderly and productive.
And the third one, capital.
Forced savings, the CPF, the Central Provident Fund. Every citizen has to save a huge chunk of their income into a state-managed fund. And then you have the government-linked corporations like Temasek. The state controls the flow of money.
Okay, so they control the board, the pieces, and the bank.
And here is the crucial insight from the analysis. The paper argues that this absolute control allows the state to maintain social trust and order much more effectively than a laissez-faire system. It can cut the transmission vector of social decay before it even starts to spread.
So in Singapore, you don't get a Toyoko zone because the state owns the land, tracks the money, and directs the labor. The problem can't even begin.
The source describes this state capacity as incredibly robust. And it argues this isn't necessarily tyranny in the way the West might define it, but rather a system that prioritizes collective well-being and performance legitimacy.
Performance legitimacy, meaning the government's legitimacy comes from its results. We may deny certain individual freedoms, but in exchange, we deliver a safe, clean, and prosperous city.
That is the trade-off. That is the social contract. And the source highlights the meritocracy aspect of it. Singapore's civil service is described as hyper-efficient, doing more with less, because they control these strategic levers. They don't need a police officer on every corner if the system itself is designed from the ground up to prevent disorder.
It's a very stark comparison. Tokyo feels like it's caught in the middle. It has the commercial discipline of the train companies, but it lacks that total state control over the land and labor. It hesitates.
And that hesitation is the Spenglerian symptom we talked about at the beginning. A civilization that is confident in its values, in its mission, enforces them immediately. A civilization that is unsure, it hesitates. It allows the entropy to build up until it requires a massive, ugly clinical police sweep to fix it.
So if we pull back and look at the big picture here, we have the physical decay of the infrastructure, the very real economic cost of the disorder, and the digital erosion of trust. And the iron law from all this seems to be that the only fix is a reassertion of will.
That is the synthesis of all these different sources. The events in Kabukicho are presented as a warning. Liberty without order leads directly to the exploitation of the vulnerable. that 16-year-old girl. Without the state's protection, without the framework of order, she isn't free. She is prey. She is prey for the scammers, for the tokuryu, for the chaos itself.
That's a sobering way to put it. We think of the police sweep as taking away her freedom, but the source material argues it was actually an act of urban sanitation, removing the predator's hunting ground.
Exactly. The transition from the messy freedom of the kids to the clinical sanitation of the police was, from this perspective, a necessary reassertion of civilization's will. It was the state saying, we still exist, we still set the rules here.
It really changes how one sees that opening scene. It wasn't just a cleanup operation. It was a battle for the soul of the city, playing out on a few square meters of pavement.
A battle between order and entropy. And as the material we've gone through concludes, the survival of a civilization isn't determined by its wealth or its slogans. It is determined by its visceral, unapologetic resolve to enforce order.
And that leads us to the final thought from this analysis, the iron law itself. It's a phrase that sticks with you, and maybe it makes one look at their own city a little differently. The maxim is simple, it's brutal, and perhaps it's necessary. Good people can only be safe when bad people are afraid.